Welcome to the June 2018 Levitt Distinguished Lectureship. I'm so glad to have you here, and I think you'll be glad you came. Louis Levitt was born in 1896, graduated from vet school in 1920, then he went to medical school in Denver and became a physician who began practice as a general practitioner in 1927. Practiced for 40 years until 1967 as a GP and then as one of the first generation of family docs. Upon his death in 1976, he had bequeathed to the Department of Family Medicine an endowment which we use for distinguished lectures in his name. Today, we have one of the best. In fact, this is a repeat performance. Hilliard Jason and Jane Westberg are here again as probably our 60th or 65th Distinguished Levitt Lecturer. And I think you're in for a treat. Let me tell you just a little bit about Hill and Jane before we get started. Hill is a co-founder and the Director of Educational Affairs for iMed Trust, something that you're going to learn more about in the next few years. It's a philanthropic initiative that sets out to establish a highly regulated, sustainable, adaptive medical education platform for training medical and health professionals around the world. It's an extremely innovative and interesting new way to train medical students and others, and Hill and Jane are going to tell us a little bit about that in the next hour. Jane, by the way, is also a member of iMed Trust and an honorary lifetime member of the network that supports iMed Trust. Hill, I would like to say, I thought it would be a good joke to say Hill was also born in 1896 with Louis Levitt, but it's not true. He has been nearly 60 years in the field of medical education, and in fact was in the field of medical education before it was a field. He has that long experience as a medical educator and as an innovator. He's been a clinical professor in schools of education and departments of psychiatry and departments of family medicine. Hill is a psychiatrist. He was born a Canadian. I think you still think of yourselves as Canadian, and if I were you, I would. This is a safety valve that Hill has. His initial training occurred at the University of Montreal, I think.
McGill University.
Yeah, McGill University, that's right. He jumped the border for a few years at the University of Buffalo, and back to McGill, and back to Rochester, and he can sort out the details of that, but basically Hill did something very interesting in those early years. He concurrently won a doctorate in medicine and a doctorate in education, concurrently. This was, I think, at the University of Buffalo. And joined what was then a team that was developing a field of medical education and faculty development. Have you ever heard of faculty development or professional development? Hill was around as part of the team that invented that. Have you ever heard of simulated patients? Hill developed that. There's a lot of stuff that you thought existed forever that actually had to be invented and developed and refined. Hill has been the editor of an international journal called Education and Health, Change in Learning and Practice. He was the editor-in-chief of that, and he has co-authored 7 books and a whole boatload of educational videos on medical education. He also, in fact, in the course of his training as an educator, led one of the largest multi-institutional studies of medical teaching that has ever been done. Right now, Hill has been He is an advisor to many of the medical schools that exist in the US and in the UK and in the Netherlands, including this medical school. And he spends most of his time thinking about iMed Trust, which is what I hope we get to devote a lot of our time to. This woman sitting beside him is his wife and his professional colleague and a force of nature. Don't be fooled by the fact that she's incredibly nice. She is the lead author in the co-authorship of the 7 books that they've written together. And she also was the co-author of a lovely biography that she wrote about her father, which was called Gentle Rebel. It's a story about a man who joined a healthcare team as a pastor, as a minister, and sort of began the movement toward whole person care many, many years ago. I commend that book to you without reservation. So I think you have before you today some really important and interesting and smart, innovative people who have been at work in the world of medical education and innovation in medical education since there was such a thing. And I would like to start this off by giving you the chance to sort of acquaint our audience with where you come from. You've been at this for a long time. You've been at this sometimes apart, and for the last 30 years or something together. I would like for you to give us a sense. Take 5 or 10 minutes together to collectively describe your professional careers and where you've come from, and sort of where that leads you to now. And we'll then get into that in more detail.
I think after that introduction, we can offer nothing but disappointment. Thank you for that generosity. I'll start personally because there is a little bit of I'm so much older. My young bride came along later. Actually, we're not that far apart, but Jane just has preserved herself much better than I have. I grew up in Montreal, and a formative event pre-medical school was through a family connection, having been told that there was an opportunity to volunteer at a charity children's camp in the summer for disadvantaged children. And that was 1948. And it turned out at that time we were still getting waves of Holocaust survivors who fell into our category of disadvantaged children, many of them orphans, many of them severely traumatized. And that was a formative experience for me. I ended up staying with that camp for many years and didn't earn much money, but I eventually became director of that camp and ran it, and that helped pay for the low medical school fees of those days. I continued to work at that camp. But that helped form what I'm going to coalesce into a few statements. One is that I went to McGill for pre-medical, for my undergraduate work, and then, like many aspiring medical students, had a long list of places to apply to. And one of my professors in psychology happened to be from New York State and told me that he was under the impression that I might not get into McGill because McGill in the early 50s still had a quota. They only took 6 Jewish students a year, and there were quite a few more than that of us who were doing pretty well in our pre-medical program. So he said, my chances weren't good, so I better apply to a place where I had a better chance. And he said from his brother, who was a doctor in New York, that University of Buffalo had a good, long reputation. It was well established, and it had never had a quota, like many other medical schools did have at that time or earlier. So I applied to Buffalo. It turned out to be the only school I ever got into. And I arrived a starry-eyed, visionary young man who believed the public relations messages that they were in the business of producing humanistic, caring, deeply scientific doctors, when in fact all I was exposed to was a bunch of lecturers who didn't seem to know what doctors needed and didn't care about much else than their own field of research, and I was seriously disillusioned. So I began to be a complainer, and I might have been kicked out of an ordinary medical school, but this, by dumb luck, turned out to be a non-ordinary medical school. It was the first in the world that we know of that had a small group of young faculty that decided that teachers in medical schools needed to learn something about education. And they managed to get a grant from the Commonwealth Fund that would provide for a serious commitment to learning about education, a whole year half-time program for this group of faculty, half from Buffalo and half recruited from around the country, and actually Canada. One of our participants was from Toronto. And near the last minute of the beginning of the first year of that intensive program, one of the people had to pull out because of a family emergency, and it dawned on George Miller, the organizer of that program, that maybe it would be good to have a student's voice in the program, and he had come to know me because of my annoyances in the program, complaining about everything. And he said, maybe it would be good to have a student voice in our program. Would you be willing to go to medical school part-time and join us in the program? So I was allowed to take 2 years to complete my 4th year of medical school and join the program. But by then I'd been reading about education, trying to understand something about it, and learned that it might be worth learning more. So I applied for and got accepted for the doctorate in education. So I was a busy young man. I was working full-time on my doctorate in education, half-time in medical school, and about half-time as a research assistant and supporter and participant in this first ever faculty development program. And that's the beginning of how I got to this place.
But you were going to say a little more to catch up to my getting started.
Yeah, Jane and I got together a little later when, in a quick series of steps, I ended up deciding that I had to have a specialty. I became a resident in psychiatry at the University of Rochester and got to be known to people there, and I got to know them. And a long story that I will spare you from. I got kicked out of the country after 2 years. What turned out to be a psychotic immigration official decided that I was a danger to the Republic. He didn't know what was coming. He didn't, but I was his example of a danger, and I got kicked out of the country. But happily, McGill took me into their psychiatry residency. I was there for 2 years, and then they permitted me to come back, and Rochester hired me back at that point, and I became their first head of a little office of medical education. But while I was there, Bob Haggerty, a pediatrician from Harvard, who turned out to be very influential in the field of family medicine indirectly, because he started a bit of a family medicine program at Harvard, was attractive to Lynn Carmichael, who you'll be hearing more about. Lynn was a generalist doctor in Miami who heard about Bob Haggerty, went to take a 1-week program workshop with him, and asked Bob if he could come back and spend a whole year with him. And Bob said, well, I can raise $7,500 for the year. Can you manage? Lynn had 2 children at that point, a wife, and he left his career, and 3 children already born. I thought the 3rd hadn't come yet, but so 3 children. He survived on that $7,500 a year to learn more about the concepts of primary care and the precursors of family practice from Bob Haggerty. Well, it happened that as I came back to Rochester, Bob Haggerty was recruited as chairman of pediatrics for Rochester, and we quickly became friends and colleagues. So he at one point invited Lynn to come. He wanted me to meet Lynn, and he wanted Lynn to spend some time with us. And Lynn and I hit it off, and very quickly the result was Lynn said, you know, we're working hard to create a profession that will be called family medicine. It doesn't exist. We have general practice, but we're redefining it as family medicine. But we're going to need faculty if we're going to have residency programs, if we're going to have departments for medical students. Where will we get our faculty? There aren't natural people who understand about education. Would you be willing to run an intensive one-week workshop in Miami between Christmas and New Year, and we'll start off by getting a dozen people who will be preparing themselves for a career in family medicine? Well, I agreed. Well, we got 95 people from Canada, throughout Canada and the United States, and that became a 5-year series, out of which many, most I'm told, of the first directors of research, of residency programs and undergraduate education programs in medical schools came through that program, and a sign that we weren't too terrible in what we were doing. Many of them came back 2 and 3 times, actually. And that, I think, was the beginning, but that brings us to an encounter with a young...
No, not yet.
Not yet?
I wasn't there quite yet, but anyway.
Well, it was during
No,
that series.
just wait a minute.
Oh, please, please. Jump in.
Okay.
Jump in.
Like Hill, I was a rebel, and I had gone to the University of Chicago lab school, John Dewey's school, where we had lots of fun, and we were taught to question. And also, when I got to college, I was just a royal pain in the neck. And but when I got out of college, I decided to do some teaching. I married a minister, and we moved down to Florida. And there were no kindergartens or preschools at that time, so I started one and used some of what I had learned at the lab school. And then Don, his name, Don Olson, took a second church in a very a neighborhood that was going through a lot of turmoil in Miami. And it was largely white families that were fleeing. There was a small African-American sub-community that had been sliced in half by a highway that had gone through, and then a huge number of Cubans coming in. And so it was just crazy. So I joined with a professor who was interested in doing a survey to try to understand what was going on. And I went around the neighborhood pulling a wagon with my 2 little boys and house to house talking to people. And it looked like there was going to be, that people were open to try to sit down and figure out what was going on. So Don set up a dialogue with people from the community. And it was very productive, and people were listening and really trying to understand. We literally had to do translations, of course, because many people were speaking Spanish. And word got out about this St. John's Lutheran Church, which was starting to be called the Center for Dialogue, because some other people had been there too. But we started getting, this was in the 60s, people from the counterculture. There was the countercultural and the establishment back in the 60s. And I had to write down, one of the first groups that came were gay men and some lesbian women who, and it was illegal in Miami for them to congregate, and they were, of course, very upset by this. So Don set up a dialogue and involved clergy, health professionals, and others so that we wouldn't be raided. And we had some very good meetings, and it went on and on. The only time we had some problems was that some of the women took me to a lesbian bar, and while we were there, somebody from behind the counter shouted out, "We're going to be raided, get that minister's wife out of here." So they got me out of there. But the other groups that came to the center, and as we were in a traditional church situation where our house, our parsonage was right next to the church, so that became sort of like an Alice's restaurant, and then all this stuff going on over at the center. And the people in those first years included Women's Liberation Group, priests and nuns who were really upset that they weren't able to do the social mission stuff they wanted to do, but the nuns in particular were really upset because they had to go to bed early. They weren't allowed to stay out when their constituents were out, and they had had enough. So we helped them make biographies or resumes so they could go out and get regular jobs, but they were still very committed to doing work. We had a crisis line developed. We had a lot of hippies hanging around, and the Republican convention was coming up, and there was a lot of worry that particularly the people protesting the war would cause problems, and we'd really need the hotline. This hotline still exists. Ralph Abernathy and some of the poor people, the new campaign has started again, or the restart, but they came with some of their mule wagons, and the first night that they were there, Ralph Abernathy thanked us and asked if people would help me with the housework and with the kids, and they said yes. And we just had a great time, and a lot of stories around that. We had civil rights activists, they were students from the university, and several of them ended up in jail, one for a long time. They should not have been in jail. We had Vets Against the War, we had farm workers, and one time the bishop was getting very upset by all the things we were doing, so he wanted to have a meeting with all these people who were meeting at the center, and we told everybody to be on their best behavior, and Lalo Valdez from the farm workers was sitting there, and Kevin, our younger son, went into the hall, and he saw Lalo and greeted him as he always did with "Viva la huelga!" So our cover was blown. But then, and one of the reasons I listed all this was that medical students came, and they were part of this. These particular ones were part of that counterculture. They were sick of just sitting in classrooms and doing basic sciences. They wanted to get out and help people, so they wanted to set up a free clinic. And the only faculty member at the University of Miami who was willing to support them was Lynn Carmichael. So Lynn came over, and we got acquainted, and I was very impressed with his ideas about family practice and his commitment to social justice. And we as a family started going to the clinic and getting care there. Meanwhile,
back to the story of Lynn meeting with me and beginning to think of how are we going to get academics for the field of family medicine, starting this series, what turned out to be a series of workshops 1 week a year in Miami. And a lot of the profession of family medicine, I think, got its start there. But Jane referred to the 60s, and for those of you a little on the younger side who haven't lived through the 60s, it was a time of quite a bit of turmoil, a lot of great upsetment, but a lot of creativity and energy. And it was a time when a lot of new medical schools got started. There was a sense of optimism financially. And when we get to talking a bit about innovation in medical education, a lot of it came out of the 60s and that spirit. And I just want to draw your attention to something. If you haven't seen it, last April, so a little over a year ago, the journal Family Medicine that I hope you look at had an issue devoted to the 50th anniversary of the Society of Teachers of Family Medicine. And Larry had an article in there that captures some of what we're talking about. And if you haven't seen it, it's just worth drawing attention because his title itself emphasizes what I'm mentioning. He described his article as Perspectives of an Early Adopter of Family Medicine as a Discipline and a Cause. And that notion of education as a cause informs a lot of what was happening in the creation of the field of family medicine, the creation of the early residencies, and 1967 is when we started these workshops, and the official approval of family medicine by the regulatory groups was, some people say 67, I think it was 68 from my memory, but right around that time, and a lot of things started happening after that. But Jane can talk a little about the first residents who came to Miami.
And even before that, we had a chance to meet because during that faculty development workshop, Lynn sent me over so we saw each other.
That's true.
And I thought he was very bright and handsome, but we were both married, so that wasn't an issue. Lynn, it was an issue, but it wasn't. So, in 1972, Lynn invited me to join the Department of Family Medicine, and he invited in all kinds of people. I mean, I was sort of a community organizer type at the time. He had psychologists, social workers, attorneys, clergy people, and he saw this whole group of people as important on the health team to provide good family practice care. And he saw all these people needed as part of teaching family practice. So we were considered a motley crew by the establishment within the medical school, but we had a great time. And we were focusing very much on communities that weren't getting adequate health care, and that included quite a few of the communities around our medical school, but also down in the Keys, Bimini, and the jail. We took on the jail, and that was interesting. Our residents were these counterculture people and very idealistic, really wanting to make a change. In '75, you had come back at least one other time and did a workshop just at the medical, just for our department. And in '75, Lynn asked me to coordinate the visit of Hill to our Department for Faculty Development.
And at that time, I had no longer been married for 2 years, and I remembered this lovely, bright woman who I had met, and I had heard a rumor that she too was no longer committed in her life to someone else. So I called Lynn and before visiting and asked if there was any chance that it was true that Jane might be available, and he said yes. So I called Jane and we made a dinner date, and only 6 months later we were married, or 8 months later we were married.
And that was thanks in part too because of another event. We were part of an organization called Human Dimensions in Medical Education, and we were doing a workshop at one of the new medical schools. And after the sessions, those of us who were facilitators would talk about our groups, but also about things going on in our life. And Tom Pym from George Washington University said, "Oh, Jane, I've got this new grant. I'll see if there's any way we can get you." So he did. And Hill was...
The missing piece is I was living in Washington at that point.
Yes, you tell them, where were you?
I was creating a first ever division of faculty development for the Association of American Medical Colleges in Washington, and living in Washington. And Jane and I decided it would be great if she could be living in Washington, but she needed work. So that's where Tom Pym steps in by pure chance. And if you don't think it's true, I promise you that in many lives and careers, pure chance is a very important component.
And in terms of my background with family medicine, they did not have a Department of Family Medicine at GW, still don't. But there was a Department of General Practice and nurse practitioners and PAs at that time. And it was really interesting. We did some things together. It's, as you know, here at the school, I know you've considered trying to do some learning together, and it was fun to do some of that. And then I was asked to run had a grant for 3 years for doing faculty development for PA programs all over the country, including this one. And Hill and another member of his staff went along, and we really enjoyed working together.
And decided we wanted to continue
and
working
you had-
together. And in parallel, at the AAMC, part of what I was doing in medical education was offering workshops for faculty around the country on aspects of, again, this wild idea that if you're going to be an educator, maybe you should know something about education. So we were offering these workshops, and I invited Jane to work with us on those. So we ended up doing that bit of work together, and that ended up being a 42-year career so far.
We moved to Miami as part of that. That's when we moved to.
We ended up in Miami, but I think we're taking a lot of biographical time, and wonder if you want to get to some of your other topics.
Well, one thing, Jane, I would like for you to say more. If I've been listening, you are this community organizer, a humanist with a wagon with 2 little boys committed to social justice wandering around in the world. Is that right?
She still does that.
And my grandchildren.
I know it's hard to see you folks up there, but I know there are a lot of women up there. And I would like to ask you to, in a frank and candid way, share with the women on the faculty here what it has been like for you during this particular era of our country's history and medicine's history, for you to be a woman, a motivated, capable, competent woman with skills and commitments. And you eventually get connected to this character. And how have you navigated your own career? And I guess the question I'd like for you to address is, how have you retained your own identity and advanced what really matters to you during this career? I suspect there are women out there that would really appreciate hearing that.
When I started, I was in family medicine. I, of course, was a non-physician and a non-male, and very aware of that initially. Lynn was very good, and the focus was on the family, and so some of us as women were talking about all kinds of issues that normally weren't part of care, even in considerations, and that was important. We were trying to recruit women in the medical school and in the residency program. And we had a dean finally, an associate dean, a woman who worked very hard on that. That darn Me Too stuff was very much part of the scene, though. I had medical students come up to me, and particularly on surgical rotations, and talk about some of the really terrible stuff that had gone on. And in terms of promotion and tenure and stuff, some really painful, difficult stuff. On a more minor level, when we'd be doing workshops, we would both be talking. I would say something, and one of the men in the audience would say, "As Hilliard said." And
Only for the good stuff.
Yeah. And he was very good about pointing out that I was the one who had said it. But it's been a balancing act. I have other things in my life. The family has been very important to me, and grandchildren. I'm very much an activist for social justice now, and involved in a whole bunch of activities. Very busy these days. In terms of my own career, we really have hit it off and have a good partnership usually. Yeah.
There are a lot of people who express amazement that we have worked so intimately for so many years without killing each other, and it's never been an issue somehow.
Occasionally. No.
That was meant to be a joke, really and truly, because it's amazing that we both, I think, had enough admiration for the other person, or enough respect or comfort or whatever, or not threatened or whatever. This is another type session where I'd be lying down instead of sitting up, but it's really gone very well. When you write 7 books together and raise a family and do all the other things we've had, it didn't feel like a test, and for some people that is a test. It felt very natural and comfortable, so I'm very happy to report that. I'm not
We're
feeling,
still alive.
right. I have all my body parts.
And like right now, I'm not as involved in IMED Trust, as you probably noticed because you're on the board, but I'm very supportive and do what I can. But I have other things that I'm interested in. And at this stage in my life, too, I'm not wanting to miss out on things while I'm still able to do it. Was there anything in particular you were hoping?
Did you have struggles or difficulties in advancing through academic ranks?
It's a very painful story, and I'd rather not share it, but I did advance.
So the answer was yes.
Yep.
And we'll leave it with that.
Yeah.
Medical education has changed a lot in the last 50 years, and you've pretty much been witness to all of that. Help us get a better sense of sort of what you were facing when you first came into this world of medical education, a need to actually train doctors, and thinking about that as a thing, as a problem to be solved. What did you go after first? What were the most important issues that needed to be rectified on this journey?
Important question, thank you. I started medical school in 1953. It happens that my latest article, which came out in April in Medical Teacher, was a historical review of the emergence of scholarship in medical education, medical education as a field of study. It happened that in '53, I very quickly sensed, for whatever reason, that education was desperately in need of reform and depth that it didn't have. So I started looking for ways to learn about medical education. So I went to the library. The only journal in medical education at that time was called the Journal of Medical Education. It's now been renamed Academic Medicine, but it was the only one available. One clue to the interest of faculty in medical education was that the AMC, in their effort to involve faculty in learning about medical education, sent free copies of the journal to quite a few faculty in the medical school. And the librarian pointed out with regret the stack of unopened envelopes of the journal that faculty had given him because they weren't interested in even opening the envelope to see what was in it, let alone read it. That was my first clue that there really was a need here. But it turned out that journal didn't teach me a whole lot because it was mostly appeals for activities. It wasn't reports on studies of what had been done, but we got into it more. But what became clear to me was a need for something that dominated my thinking from then on and dominates my thinking for IMED Trust, that there is an issue in institutions generally, but certainly in medical education institutions, of what is best summarized by the word culture. There's a culture that implies the shared values, the shared commitments, the shared assumptions, the shared practices that are taken for granted, what are technically called cultural norms. And institutions develop cultural norms. And if we, even at that young age, I could sense, if we were going to make a difference in medical education, the underlying culture had to be changed. There had to be a values shift. People had to take seriously and care about things they were disparaging of or didn't even know they should be thinking about. And that would only come if there was simultaneously at the top of the institution and at the grassroots a coming together of people who would look at some questions that were critical, like, are we paying attention to what's needed in the doctors that we're producing? Are we really paying attention to the outcomes? And that was the beginning of what happily is now a movement in medical education, outcomes-oriented medical education. It is dominating the serious literature in the field. And we had to start putting into place some successes that would attract attention. So that, in the shortest summary, would be what dominated my thinking, and happily others as well. And the next thing was to attract people into medical education who would study it, who cared about it as a scholarly field of understanding. And it didn't happen in the 60s nearly as much as later into the 70s and 80s. Some serious people started thinking that, a doctoral dissertation studying some aspect of medical education might be interesting. That's what mine was. Mine turned out to be the largest study ever done observing medical teaching in action. That was my dissertation, where I trained a group of my professors in the education school and a few in the medical school to be critical observers of the process that happens in classrooms and in other educational situations in clinics, and to be critically observant of the process that's happening, not the words or information that are transmitted, but the process that's going on. And that's another dominant theme. We had to shift from content to process as a preoccupation. So that is still a work in progress.
You've done things like, in fact, both of you have been conspicuous in your efforts around simulated patients, around studying doctoring and taking that apart and learning how that process of reaching an understanding or a diagnosis or managing a complex problem, what have you done there? What was missing, and what did you work on that has moved us forward there?
Your
I
program
guess
at
I
Michigan
have to
State.
talk about that because
Yeah.
in those early days, a man who was then a young man, sadly no longer living, a man by the name of Howard Barrows, had been a professor of neurology at the University of Southern California. And he was asked to develop a way of assessing the students after their neurology rotation, and he had the brilliant idea of training some professional actors, because he was there in Los Angeles, where the city is filled with out-of-work actors who he could easily recruit, and he prepared them to simulate patients, but in his case, with neurological conditions, to assess the students. I learned about that through a little network and went to visit Howard, saw what he was doing. I became somewhat critical of what he was doing, which strained our relationship for a little while, but we returned to being collaborators on many other things later. But what I took from that exposure was the sense that we could prepare beginning medical schools and first-year medical students to learn to communicate with patients using simulated patients. So we developed, I think, the first simulated patient program ever. And just so you know, I was absolutely convinced, this is now in the 60s, it's 1965, 66, that we needed to videotape the process because people had to make their own decisions about what they were doing, because when you talk to students, you know you were not paying attention to the patient. Students would look at you dumbfounded. Of course I was. It was only when they looked at a video of themselves and said, my God, I wasn't paying attention. Look at me. I'm looking at my notes. I'm asking questions about topics that were different from what they were talking about. Except in those days, to videotape somebody, you needed the camera, just a camera, this big, on a huge tripod, and to record it, you didn't do it on your phone, you did it on another device that was this big. And Jane and I ended up carting those kind of things around to the workshops we did, each item in a giant suitcase.
And we did this videotaping also with faculty because we realized they needed to understand the process. So we had multiple cameras going on. It would first be the student with the patient, and then they'd have a recording, and then the faculty members would supervise the students.
It wasn't multiple cameras. We could only
No,
manage one.
one
With
camera. Sorry, multiple
recordings,
recordings. Yeah.
one after another.
Yeah. Playing back. Yeah. Yeah.
Getting people to critique what they did, first as a clinician, then as a supervisor of that clinician, then as a supervisor of the supervisor. So we got multiple layers of people getting in touch with what they were doing and understanding themselves in ways they never had. Because if you haven't seen yourself doing your work on video, you're in for what I hope will not be too humiliating, but will be educational.
And we started, you started it there, but we started doing it in other settings, having multiple students at once or multiple residents at once, and stopping the tape or having them stop the tape at critical juncture points and looking at the variety of choices that we have throughout encounters, and either an encounter with a student or an encounter with a patient.
There's something that you said was very striking early on when you were describing your medical education, which was boring, memorizing, and not attending whatsoever to what you actually needed. I think that medical education is quite different now from that. How did we get from there to here?
Slowly.
Very slowly.
Happily, there's a growing openness, and it's not always the young people. In one of the studies I did and then replicated, the surprise to many was that while we often think as young people as the sole source of innovation, creativity, and rebellion, it turned out from some good data that the other group are the older faculty, the faculty who no longer are worried about tenure, promotion, salary, or are more comfortable in their lives and in their personhood, really, who also were open. And those two groups in some schools, there's a lot of schools that haven't changed that much from those days, but a growing number of schools have made wonderful progress, as this school is in the midst of doing it. It has done, and it's doing it again thanks to leadership that's in this room. There are a growing number of people who are saying, we've got to be more rational about this. We've got to understand that you can't just do it because it's always been done. You've got to ask questions about what you're doing. And a big shift, and one that hasn't occurred sufficiently yet, and I'm still sweating over it a bit, is creating a culture in which asking questions is honored rather than suppressed. And there are still classes and there's still supervisory sessions where students and residents are unfortunately demeaned for such things as, that's a stupid question, or don't interrupt, or anything that squelches curiosity, squelches exploration, in any way turns off personal initiative toward learning, toward examining root causes. We talk more comfortably now in family medicine and in other fields about upstream sources of illness. Well, there are upstream sources of aberrations in education. There are ways it starts, and we haven't until relatively recently been systematic about looking at root causes, looking at origination. And one of them, sadly, is that most educators still, I'm persuaded, in medical education, know only what they were subjected to when they were students. They replicate, we have an intergenerational perpetuation of educational practices that go back multiple generations because there's been no intrusion of alternative ideas and thinking along that trajectory.
And even when there is intrusion, when people have really learned, gotten a lot of success as a lecturer or this or that, for them to make that change is huge. We worked with a surgical society, and watching the transformation to minimally invasive surgery, and the older people who had done open cases and were so good at it now found that their residents were more able, because of their video game playing and all, to do some of these things. So those chairs of departments and senior members of departments understandably dragged their feet about moving forward, but eventually there was enough momentum. And
Where there's death, there's hope.
yes. Oh dear.
Wow. I'm just still puzzling over that intergenerational transfer of what we experienced, and without intervening knowledge acquisition and practice and experience. It's quite an indictment. Probably quite sustaining of that culture you were talking about. Well, let's hurry on along now, and I would suggest that you have assimilated much, if not all, that you have learned about how humans learn and about medical education into your design and the features of this thing called iMed Trust. And I think it would really be interesting to our audience if you could, and I know this is hard, but if you could fairly succinctly just state the fundamental principles that underlie this innovative approach to medical education as a starting point, and then we'll keep going from there.
Thank you. I guess I should pick up on that. I've been thinking of myself as somebody who was restless and pushing that proverbial rock up the hill for a lot of years. And I keep being told by others that I've been too far ahead of the curve, that people weren't ready for our books. We wrote most of our books in the 90s, and I run into people now, 20 years later than some of them, saying, that was 20 years ahead of the curve if people weren't ready for it. I wish those books came out now with current references anyway. Right now, I am persuaded that the world has been catching up, and there is an amazing readiness for the kinds of things some of us have been pushing for a long time. And too long a story to even summarize adequately, about 8 years ago, together with some colleagues in Europe, we began exploring the possibility of creating a model medical school that held nothing back, that wasn't constrained by those eager to retain tradition for its own sake rather than because it had proven itself, that we would really start fresh, tabula rasa. A number of things evolved from there, and the people involved have shifted a bit over those 8 years. But what became clear about 7 years ago, 6.5 years ago, was that what we were talking about was dealing with the largest social problem in healthcare that we know of. That there are 1 billion people in this world who have virtually no health care because there are no health professionals available to them. There's nobody in their community, their region, who they could reach out to for help, and the consequences are massive in terms of suffering, early death, disability, breakup of families, and what appeals to some people, loss of economic productivity as an issue for a country and certainly a region. And what evolved was this imagining, and it's still imagining because we don't exist yet. All of this has been a substantial effort to be prepared to raise the money we need for what is a totally philanthropic effort to establish a research and development center in a hospitable location that would develop the procedures, techniques, and optimal uses of inexpensive technologies that would enable us to begin preparing educators in the so-called global south, the less well-developed parts of the world that are without health care, so that they can begin to educate their own talented citizens and capable young people to learn in their regions and countries, not go to the UK or the US or somewhere other economically advantaged place to learn medicine and then be so seduced by the surface attractions of those places that they never go home, which has been, as you know, this country is a recipient country of donor support from the least economically well-off locations of the world. And in a major fantasy of reversing that a bit and helping assure that there is health care in the country itself that's needed, rather than only what's already being done. And there's some good stuff being done that I don't want to gloss over. There are some hugely generous people in this country, in the UK, and other advanced locations that volunteer their services for weeks, months, even a year at a time to render health care where there's none now available. The issue is, with some exceptions, mostly they don't leave anything substantial behind when they leave. When they leave, they take themselves with them. They have no choice but to take their own talents with them, and they leave behind people who can't do it for themselves yet. And this whole notion is to see if, with a lot of support from a lot of good people, we can start helping those parts of the world start doing things for themselves, because I promise you, without hesitation, that in those countries, there are young people with enormous potential who never get to realize that potential for lack of opportunity, lack of support. And this is our hope, is that we'll provide that. We're getting very close, folks, after 8 years. We have a university without a medical school in the London area. It's a long story why we chose London, but it is a persuasive story as to why that turns out, in our judgment, after very careful examination, to be the most promising location that we know of to have this hub university, this research and development undertaking that will develop these human strategies and tactics and the technological support strategies that will enable us to begin educating people who are based in the global south, who are preparing themselves to be leaders of healthcare and education in the global south, and who we work with to support to develop educational programs there. So that, in a nutshell, is the motivation, the mission, the hope. It's what got us approved as what's called a registered charity in England, so we are respected as a not-for-profit that will be hopefully doing some social good. And happily sitting here is one of the members of our small but very important board of trustees, Larry, who's only working 110% time, seemed free enough to work with us, and he's been enormously helpful.
So Jane, or either of you, whoever best does, now take that vision and advise this audience what the educational principles are that are sine qua nons, that must be part of this for it to build off of the science of education, and particularly for healthcare providers. And we don't have to do the whole thing here,
Yeah.
but three or four teasers say, this is a fundamental thing.
That learners are all very different and adaptive. Yeah.
something that's been on my mind for a very long time that hopefully is being realized with this project, which I've summarized with the phrase adaptive education. It's now become a fairly widely used phrase. We have offered pre-conference workshops on that subject for 4 years now at the largest gathering of medical educators in the world, the so-called Association for Medical Education in Europe, which is a legacy name that's a misnomer because their conference attracts people from about 92 countries in the world. They get 3,700 people. It's the largest gathering of people who are coming together each year just about health professions education, mainly medical. It's very inspiring. It's an exciting conference for anybody who cares about health professions education. In any case, we've been offering these workshops and working with people, and adaptive education is now at least on the radar sufficiently that Medical Teacher, the journal of the AME, of AMEE, which is now 40 years old as a journal, will have its August issue this year devoted to adaptive education as its theme. And we have an article coming out in that journal, and it's in people's conversation, and the essence of it in our tight time schedule is that each learner is unique, full stop. Each person has their own cultural, religious, family, assumption, problem, experiential background that causes their brain maps, their ways of perceiving the world to be unique. And to have a standard practice of putting 150 young people in a room and talking at them for 50 minutes and assume anything like the same thing is happening in each of the brains of the people who happen to show up, never mind the people who weren't even in the room, and to somehow think that's acceptable as education will someday be acknowledged as flat out irrational. And our notion is there will be no such thing as large group gatherings. The largest group will be eight learners at a time, and we want those together because they will be opportunities to learn something else other than what a teacher conveys by talking at them. It will be an opportunity to learn to collaborate, because if there's anything dominating the current and, as best we can tell, future of healthcare, is that these will all be collaborative professions. This is too big for any one person or one profession at this time. So these groups of 8 will be collaborative learning groups, as we're labeling them, but a lot of the learning will be individually, in pairs, in triplets, in different combinations, depending what the outcomes are meant to be. There will be a huge dedication to simulation. It's a whole session in itself to talk about the underutilization of simulation, even in schools like this that have moved toward the use of simulation. We know a lot about simulation and its potential. It is hugely more valuable than a lot of what happens when students show up in a ward and wait for somebody to come along and they sit around twiddling their thumbs, as the data tell us. They're doing a lot of their time, and they take a patient at random, which is not necessarily the optimal patient problem for what they need to be focusing on. Simulation gives us the power to control the variables. Simulation cannot be done without the counterpoint of reality. We have to go back and forth between a simulated world and a real world, and that's a long story in itself. But we know a lot about these things now. They need to be put into practice. We think we have a chance to become a model of some of those kinds of approaches to education.
Let me say something back to you, and as this guy over here often does for me, he repairs things that I say. Repair what I'm about to say. I just heard you say that in your adaptive education model, instead of starting off with a prescribed curriculum delivered in a particularly prescribed way, expecting 150 students to all be able to handle that instead of that, your approach to medical education, I would say, is diagnose the student first. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. In fact, what you've just introduced nicely, Larry, of the many things I've left out in my summary, one of them is that if you want to understand what we need to do in medical education, think about the clinical care process as a process, not content, process. What do? We begin by being diagnostic. And if you're a good diagnostician, as family physicians have been most of the time, you get to know the person as a person, not just as a sick individual with a disease and symptoms and signs to be found. Those are important, but that's not the whole story. You understand their cultural context. You understand their family context. You don't tell a mother of 3 young children to take a nap every afternoon. Yet you begin to think more broadly about who this person is and what they need. This is what we need in education. We need to begin by learning who our learners are. But there's one more step. A big lesson learned with a lot of scars along the way is that you can't start a new adventuresome educational program and then recruit people in the same old way to be the leaders or implementers of that program. You need to be careful who you choose. And that applies to students and faculty both, because one of the lessons I also stand by now is that the moment of selecting somebody as a student or as a faculty member is the most influential moment you will ever have in your relationship with that person. We can't change people as well as we can select them the right way in the first place.
But we do want to go ahead, once you've selected people, it's so important to have programs to prepare students for this new way of learning and to prepare faculty so they have the skills and the comfort. And so a big part of the IMED Trust program is faculty development and using the same strategies we hope to use with students in preparing the faculty for their work with students.
Would you say more about that? Now, as I understand it, the IMED Trust Medical School does not have aspirations to be in the top 10 NIH-funded biomedical research institutions.
Correct.
But that instead, it aims to be on the bleeding edge of the science of human learning and how that science can be improved, how technologies can be developed and deployed to augment the education of healthcare professionals. So you're going to have a research institute of some sort?
Yeah. There'll be 2 themes of our research institute. One will be the educational process, the other will be population health. And those 2 areas will be areas of dominant focus, population health, particularly under conditions of deprivation. The one other thing that I should try to slip in here if there's a moment, and that is that when Jane mentioned the faculty development, we're choosing to call it educator development because faculty implies a hierarchical position in the structure. We're calling it educator development because we want to blur all hierarchies. Our hypothesis is, it hasn't been fully tested yet, but this is one of our commitments, is that the moment of being accepted as a medical student, we want our learners to feel that they're truly along the path of becoming professionals, and we want them to start incorporating the self-image of them not as subjugated people taking instructions from above, but as people taking responsibility for their own learning, of participating as collaborators in the fashioning of their own program. So they're going to participate in the educator development program along with the faculty. And we want everybody in the institution, as back to culture, a culture where everybody really truly perceives themselves as a learner and as a potential educator, because I promise you there are in this school entering medical students who are more capable in some areas than their own faculty members in some particular areas. And one of my lessons decades ago was the experience of owning an airplane, which I wanted to share with somebody else, to rent it from me as part-time because I wasn't using it enough and it was getting expensive. And the person who applied and who got the position was the country's oldest medical student. He was a medical student in Washington, D.C. He had been admitted at age 45 to GW. A very experienced, seasoned man, very wise, mature man at that point, who hadn't gone to medical school because he couldn't afford it, but now was a very wealthy, successful businessman who cut off all his business connections and devoted himself. And he was perpetually demeaned and dismissed by the residents who supervised him, who were half his age, and half as experienced and half as wise. And that was decades ago, and it was one of the tipping points for me in understanding the need for the blurring of hierarchies and the development of the one other key word. You've asked for the key things about IMED Trust. One of the key words is humility. One of the distinguishing features of much of family medicine is that it has been as attractive to me as it has been as a specialty, was its relatively far less level of arrogance compared to some other specialties I've had the privilege of working with over the decades, and translating lack of arrogance into humility. Humility is the foundation of being willing to acknowledge that we have something to learn, maybe even from somebody a lot younger than us. So that's part of the culture we hope to have.
We're running out of time. I could sit here all day. As a closing word, so we're in a medical school. This is faculty. These are faculty and learners, residents, students in a medical school that's a little different from IMED Trust. In some ways, you would probably characterize us as hidebound, tradition constrained, and other sorts of limitations that we hope to escape. What do you imagine might be an important gesture or set of initiatives we could or should take on right now to improve the quality of the health professionals we produce here?
I'm glad you're giving me an opportunity to say something, then I'll turn it to Jane. We're having the privilege tomorrow of being responders to an initiative that Shanta has led as the Senior Associate Dean for Medical Education in this school. That curriculum committee and its many subcommittees have produced a series of documents that tell me that this school is on that road already. The people writing those reports, thinking those thoughts about what needs to be done, tell me with considerable conviction that the transition has started to happen in this school. It is not what we experience, and we've been on the faculty of this department, as you know, and we used to do faculty development in this department, and we had occasion through that to work with other departments. And I won't take the time to tell you the arrogance we've been exposed to in this medical school of people who were so utterly dismissive that they could possibly learn anything about education. I think they're no longer here. I hope they're no longer here. Not in the family medicine, it was in other departments. But in terms of what most needs to be done, there has to be, I don't think it's escapable, there has to be unrestrained, full bore support from on top of the medical school. There has to be a sense that you won't be sacrificing your career by devoting time and attention to medical education issues, doing research in the area, reading in the area, learning what other people are doing. It's a respectable thing for a faculty member to do. I would like to think it's at the top tier of what a faculty member should be doing, but that has to happen. If it's not there, grassroots aren't enough. But if it is there, then grassroots has to be cultivated, and there has to be a synergy between the readiness of the leadership and the responsiveness of those who are young. And the young people have to be really trusting that they aren't sacrificial lambs because they enjoy learning about education.
That's what I was going to say. I've just been, so thrilled with reading these documents and seeing these great ideas and looking forward to the retreat tomorrow to learn more. And the process that you've gone through of meeting with people at all levels in the medical school, I think is helping to prepare for the very things you were talking about.
Thank you for a wonderful hour.
Thank you.
Join me in thanking them for